Wow, that was very nice. Our church has a bell choir as well, and it's always lovely to hear the bells playing. In fact, our music director at Knox Presbyterian Church in Meaford is Eleanor McDougall, and I believe Eleanor's sister is a member of this congregation. I cannot remember her name off the top of my head right now, but so we have a connection there as well, so that was great. Now we'll see. We can put up the first slide. So I have been involved with the Canadian Foodgrains Bank as the Ontario rep for about 2.5 years now, starting in 2020. But prior to that, I was and still am actually, involved with our Big Head River Growing Project in Meaford. That started in 1997, so I've been involved with Foodgrains Bank programming for almost 25 years now, but in this last 2.5 years as the official rep for Ontario and Quebec. And I have to say that in that time, traveling across the provinces, and meeting various people in various churches, I have met literally hundreds of people who have been involved with the work of Canadian Foodgrains Bank and the work that they do, and their dedication to the cause of ending world hunger certainly has been an inspiration to me, and I certainly am inspired by what they are doing and all the work that folks are doing. I want to say a special thanks today to Bill McLeish. Bill was instrumental in getting me involved in this particular service. I stayed with Bill last fall, I think, it was sometime for an evening, and we had a great conversation, and to Jeannie for bringing this together and organizing it as well. So thank you for having me, and I hope that I can impart some of the information about Canadian Foodgrains Bank and what we're doing to the rest of you. So as I said, it's been an inspiring journey for the last 2.5 years being a part of Canadian Foodgrains Bank. And we'll move to the next slide. I'm not sure that this is working. So the mission of Canadian Foodgrains Bank is to end global hunger, and our vision is a world without hunger. Pretty lofty goal, but we have to start somewhere. And we are rooted in the belief that humankind, is made in the image of God, and as such, God does not want to see his people go hungry and to suffer. There is enough food in the world to feed everybody. It's just that not everybody has equal access to that food. Next slide. So the Canadian Foodgrains Bank is made up of 15 churches and church-based agencies, all of which you see listed here on this particular slide. And of course, the United Church of Canada is one of those members. The Foodgrains Bank started in the late 70s, actually, with the Mennonite Central Committee, who recognized the need in Ethiopia and other African countries where food was short and people were starving. And so they worked with farmers in central Canada to take some of the surpluses that those farmers had and ship them overseas to help people who needed food. And from that very beginnings in the late 70s and then in the early 80s, the Canadian government became involved with providing matching assistance funds, and the Mennonite Central Committee asked other churches to become a part of this effort, and thus Canadian Foodgrains Bank was born in 1983. So we are coming up to our 40th anniversary as an organization helping to fight hunger in the world. The one chief difference between the Canadian Foodgrains Bank then and Canadian Foodgrains Bank today is that in those early years, we shipped 90% of the food aid required from Canada overseas into the developing world where it was needed. Today, we ship nothing. It is all purchased locally, and that has the many benefits. It has the benefit of not having to pay for shipping costs, which take up a huge amount of the resources. It has the benefit of not having products sitting on the docks that may rot. It has the benefit of providing a market to the people in the developing countries who have product to sell, and we're not competing with them by shipping a boatload of product, competing with them in those countries. And it also is providing the people who are looking for food assistance with the foodstuffs that they're used to having. You can well imagine shipping a load of wheat into a country where they don't know what wheat is and where they're used to rice, how that might disrupt their diets and help make it uncertain for them how to use those products. So all of our food assistance work, all of our long-term response work is done using local resources today. This is an older slide based on our previous fiscal year of 2020-2021, and that was the first full year of the pandemic, where we provided $49 million of assistance for almost 1 million people in 33 countries. That first full year of the pandemic was a record year for Canadian Foodgrains Bank. We were unbelievably humbled and grateful for the support of Canadians who recognize the need around the world of people who are suffering because of the pandemic. And so, as I said, this was our biggest year to date in terms of resources, in terms of donations that came in, and in terms of our programming that we were able to do. The great news is that this last fiscal year, which was just completed at the end of March, continued that trend and was an even better year. And although the numbers aren't finalized, we have had 2 record years in a row. And so we are very, very grateful to Canadians, people like yourselves who support the work of Foodgrains Bank and who are helping others around the world, making sure that they have enough to eat. So the public support for Canadian Foodgrains Bank is very, very strong all across the country. Invariably, when I'm talking especially to new donors, they always refer to their internet research and to the fact that Canadian Foodgrains Bank has a top 10 charity intelligence rating. You can look that up. Charity Intelligence rates many Canadian charities based on the impact that they have, and a top 10 impact rating means that they're achieving about a $7 rate of assistance of impact for every dollar that's invested. So we're very happy with that, and that has garnered us a lot of support. We have over 200 growing projects across Canada. Growing projects are a farmer or a group of farmers working together with a church congregation or a community to help grow a crop. It may be on 5 acres, it may be on 10 acres, it may be on 100 acres. In fact, our western growing projects are often a quarter section or a half a section of land of 640 acres, thereabouts. So those growing projects raise crops, the crops are sold, the proceeds come to Canadian Foodgrains Bank. The part that the churches play and the community play is fundraising for the input costs, although many of our input costs are supplied by the companies themselves. So we have great support all across rural Canada for the work of Canadian Foodgrains Bank. 1 in 9 people in the world don't have enough food. When I started with our Big Head River project in Meaford in 1997, we talked about 1 billion people around the world that didn't have enough to eat. Over the years, that number declined to about 620 million in about 2014. So not only were the absolute numbers coming down, but the percentage of people that were hungry was also decreasing because the world population, of course, was increasing. Unfortunately, in the last 7 years, we have seen that number start to turn around and more people are again hungry. Economic poverty, economic issues have always been a part of poverty and not having enough to eat, but more recently, conflict and wars have caused people to not be able to provide for themselves because they're displaced from their cities, from their lands. You only have to look at places like Syria and Yemen to recognize that that has been happening in the past. But of course, more recently, in the last couple of months, the situation in Ukraine has been an absolutely devastating thing to the numbers of hungry people in the world and to the potential food shortages in the world. We are facing what could be a food catastrophe because 30% of the world's exports in wheat and in barley come from the Ukraine. Those have been shut off, and so I read the other day that Ukraine exports help to feed about 400 million people. So that means there may be 400 million people who won't have access to that source of food unless they can find other sources of food. The United Nations is already saying that they are taking food away from hungry people to feed starving people. So the whole Ukraine situation with Russia and Ukraine has been a very dire situation impacting food supplies around the world. And we can only hope and pray that it ends soon so that we can get back to some sort of food chain supply that is more closer to normal. Climate change has been another major impact that has impacted people. I talked to people in Malawi and in India, the farmers there, who are struggling with climate change. These are people who have no political agenda other than to say that the weather that we are facing here is very different. The rains don't come as often, or if they do come, they're too heavy. Sometimes their droughts are impacting their ability to grow crops. Overall, it's making it much harder for them to grow crops. And so climate change is having an impact as well. And of course, over the last 2 years, the COVID pandemic has severely affected people. People lost jobs because jobs were lost. They were no longer existent. And people who lost jobs had no income. With no income, they had no way of buying food. And the food that they were buying was often a result of what they earned yesterday or today. And so those people went hungry very, very quickly. So today we're talking in terms of over 800 million people that are hungry, and you will likely see that number increasing dramatically over the next few months. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about our Malawi study tour that happened in February of 2018. And on that study tour, we went and visited several projects of Canadian Foodgrains Bank and the members as they were helping people. So the first project that we visited was a Nazarene Compassionate Ministries program operated by NCM Canada and NCM Malawi. And this is a food assistance program. So food assistance is one of 3 areas in which Canadian Foodgrains Bank programming occurs. Food assistance, as the term says, provides food for those who are unable to access food for themselves. So think of people who are in refugee camps, who have been displaced by war and conflict. Think of people who have been affected by weather events, droughts that have caused them not to be able to grow crops, excess rainfall that has washed away their crops and their produce. Those are the people that we're helping with food assistance programming. And 60% of Canadian Foodgrains Bank resources go into this particular area. This is Kalinda David. Kalinda David is 52 years old. At the time of this visit, she was looking after 7 grandchildren, and she has a husband who wasn't part of the pictures when we were there because he's elsewhere working, but she also looks after a paralyzed brother. And you can see the ration up there that she was provided for on a monthly basis, enough to keep them going, but not a lot of excess. And because of her situation, she was deemed to be at risk and so became part of the NCM Food Assistance Program. So the next slide shows Kalinda in her cornfield. The average size of farms in Malawi is 2 acres. So they rely on 2 acres of land to provide them with enough food to last the entire year. And you can see this is corn that is in about the 2nd or 3rd year of growth. It's very sparse, it's very spindly, and it's very unlikely, in fact it is unlikely, that she would grow enough out of this particular crop to feed her family for the coming year. And there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, at the beginning of the season, she and her husband were helping others plant their crop because they needed to get income to keep their family going and to provide food for themselves. So while they were doing that, the crops were being planted earlier. Those earlier crops benefited from some earlier rains and have done very well. And if you look at the top left-hand corner of the screen, you can see crops in the background that look much healthier, much taller. Her corn being planted later was affected more by lack of rainfall and drought. But also corn, in this particular case on her land, has been growing year after year after year. And corn is very demanding of soil fertility, and so the soil loses its fertility when corn is planted year after year after year. And the third thing that I noticed is that her corn is planted in clumps, 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 seeds per hole. The corn grows up, and each plant competes against itself, and so instead of one strong plant that yields well, you get 5 or 6 plants that are very spindly and don't yield well at all. So I asked Kalinda, I said, if your crop fails again this year, and it certainly looked like it would, will you try something else? And her answer struck me and surprised me, and she said, no, we need to have corn. And that was true. When we talked to people in Malawi, they said if they don't have a meal that has corn in it for the day, they feel like they haven't eaten properly. And so they are dependent on corn, or that's the way their life has become. And it struck me then that it really is a lack of knowledge that is holding many of these people back because they've done things the same way for years and years and years, and they don't know how to do things any differently. So moving from that scenario to the next slide, this is Pressings Moyo. And Pressings is part of a long-term response program, the MAFA project, which is the Malawi Agroecology Farmer to Farmer project. Long-term response is the second of 3 areas that the Foodgrains Bank has programming in. About 35% of our work goes into this. And as the term indicates, it's a long-term response. It's teaching farmers how to do things a little bit differently, how to grow different crops, how to improve soil fertility, how to use crop rotation, all those techniques that allows them to get more out of the 2 acres of land that they own. This is a program operated by Presbyterian World Service and Development and Global Affairs Canada. It was actually a follow-up to smaller projects that began in the year 2000, and so in 2018 we were on the tail end of this MAFA project. Pressings was my host farmer. I stayed with him for 3 nights and 4 days. We all split up and had homestays during the time that we were there, and so I had a great chance to talk with him. He speaks good English, and we were able to communicate and learn about how his life was and what he had been able to achieve over the many years that he had been involved through some of these programs. He's a community leader in his area, so what he learns, he is able to transfer on to others who come to him for advice and for information, and he hosts community events from time to time to teach people about what he has learned as well. So, as part of the MAFA project, or the precursor to the MAFA project, next slide, he started to grow pigeon peas and groundnuts. He took 1 acre of land out of 10 acres that he has, so he's a large farmer by Malawian standards. And he told us on that 10 acres of land he couldn't feed himself, his wife, and his family of 8 children. But he took 1 acre of land with the start of this project and started to grow pigeon peas and groundnuts. Pigeon peas are peas, groundnuts are peanuts, but both of these plants are legumes. And legumes have the unique ability to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it in the soil so that it replenishes some of the nutrient value of the soil. So he grew these products for 2 years. Now, not only is he replenishing some of the nitrogen in the soil, he's also being introduced to new crops that he can add into his crop rotation, crops that provide protein for many Malawians are heavily reliant on starch. So this is adding protein to their diet, which is new to them, and so that's been a good thing as well. So after 2 years of growing these two crops, next slide, he started to grow corn again on this field. And he was utterly amazed at the difference in this corn, how that pigeon peas and ground nuts, the fertilizing effect that they had, how it resulted in so much taller corn that yielded much better. He was also taught 1 seed per hole, holes that are 6 inches apart, rows that are 15 inches apart, give each plant some spacing. And it made a huge difference in the crop, and he was amazed at how improved this crop was. And so from that point on, he started to implement more of these techniques across his 10 acres. So now he's growing not only corn and pigeon peas and ground nuts, but he's added millet and soybeans, cassava, chili peppers, a whole range of cropping, and he's become more than food secure in his own requirements. He's got extra that he can now sell. And that's resulted in him improving his standard of living. It's allowed him to send his children on for education beyond grade 8, so it's been a huge benefit, not in terms of feeding his family, not only in terms of feeding his family, but also in terms of his ability to further educate his children and improve his lifestyle. So next slide. Jane Saronda was another lady who was involved with this program at the same time as Pressings, and I think she really sums up what this all means to her with this quote. She says, using these new farming techniques means no more piecework, no more hospital for sick children, no more worries. She doesn't have to go out elsewhere to work like Kalinda was doing to make ends meet. She's able to plant her corn and her crops on time. She's able to see the benefits of those early rains and get the yields that she requires. Her children are healthy because they have enough to eat. She doesn't have to run to the hospital with them all the time wondering what's wrong with them. And of course, we can all appreciate the fact that with that kind of improvement, her life is a whole lot less stressful. So meaning no more worries. So next slide. When we were there in Malawi, we met this lady whose name is Esther at the in the Ekwendeni region, or the Ekwendeni Hospital. And Esther is one of the head people at the Ekwendeni Hospital. And when we were there, Esther told us a very interesting story that resonated with me as soon as I heard it. And I'm going to tell that story to you now. Back in the year 2000, a young lady by the name of Rachel Besner-Kerr came from Canada, came from Ontario, to Malawi looking for 10 women to work with to help them improve their nutrition, to teach them and give them some cooking skills, teach them about some new crops that they could grow, but overall to improve their whole nutritional aspect of their lives. And so she came to Esther. Esther found 10 women who were willing to be a part of this. Rachel worked with them. She taught them a few things, and over time they took on some of this information and they went back to their villages happy in what they had learned, graduated, so to speak, from this particular episode of this course that Rachel was putting on, and were very happy in what they had learned. Rachel returned to Canada. She finished her master's program. But the following year, more women came forward, having learned from their neighbors some of these new techniques and wanted to learn more. So Esther and her colleagues at the Ekwendeni Hospital carried on with the program. And that year, again, more people went back to their villages, happy in the knowledge they had learned. And so the program carried on. It eventually became formalized into the Soil, Food, and Healthy Nutrition Program, which then became the MAFA program that I talked about with Pressings in 2012. And Esther told us that in that time period, from 2000 to 2018 when we were there, over 15,000 farm families, 15,000 families had benefited from what started out with 10 women, and they had become food secure in their own requirements. Now 15,000 families, multiply that by 6, 7, or 8 people per family, that's over 100,000 people that in that time period became food secure in their requirements, just because of some simple things, learning some very simple knowledge that helped them improve their cropping ability, their ability to improve soil fertility, just allowing them to become much more progressive and food secure in their requirements. And when I heard that story, it reminded me so much, it immediately hit me that this is so much like the story that we read this morning in the Bible of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Jesus taking those 5 loaves and those 2 fish, breaking them and feeding, as the Bible tells us, 5,000 men, not including women and children. The same thing happens here with the donations that we get from people like yourselves. That $5, that $10, $20, $50. When it comes to Canadian Foodgrains Bank, the Canadian government has a 4-to-1 matching program on food assistance work. So that donation can be increased by 5 times with that 4-to-1 match. And then the Canadian dollar, the strength of the Canadian dollar in these developing countries allows that dollar to get stretched so much more. And then through the judicious use of this money by our members and by their partners, we are able to feed not 5, 10, 20, or 50 people. We feed hundreds and thousands of people with what starts out as small donations. So do you see the similarity there between Jesus breaking the bread and the fish and feeding the 5,000 people and the donations that come in to Canadian Foodgrains Bank and how that's multiplied to do the same thing? But I want to take a little closer look at that story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. You'll note that as Jesus is talking to the people, the disciples come to him later in the day and they say, "Lord, it's getting late. These people have nothing to eat. Send them back to their villages so that they can feed themselves." And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, "You feed them. You give them something to eat." And that's the message that comes home to us here in Canada and around the world, those of us who are so well off, so blessed. He's telling us it's our responsibility to feed those around the world who don't have enough to eat, those in our community who don't have enough to eat, those in our country who don't have enough to eat. Jesus is asking us to help feed those people all around the world. And the disciples respond to that. Well, how are we supposed to do that? Another scripture tells us that they ask him and they say, "It would take 8 months' worth of wages for us to feed all these people." And Jesus says, "Well, what do you have?" And they say, "We have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, hardly enough to feed this crowd." Jesus says, "Bring them to me." And of course, we know the story. He divides them and feeds the 5,000 people. And the message there is it doesn't matter the size of our gift. Anything that's small, anything that's large, Jesus can take those gifts and do so much more with them. So if you think you don't have the resources, think again about this story, how Jesus took those 2 meager offerings of bread and fish to feed the 5,000. The same thing can happen here with the offerings that we get through Canadian Foodgrains Bank. Next slide. So what can you do? Well, we've already talked about giving, and you're doing that, and we appreciate that very, very much. But also prayer. Prayer is so important. Pray for those who are hungry. Pray for those who are facing difficult situations. Pray for those who are doing the work, people at Canadian Foodgrains Bank, people in other organizations who are helping to feed hungry people around the world. Prayer is so important. Learn about the work of Canadian Foodgrains Bank, as you're doing here. Thank you for having me to help you understand some of the things that we're doing. Learn about hunger, how it impacts people. Read the news. See what you're hearing about Ukraine and Russia and how that's going to impact food supplies around the world. It's devastating. And probably most importantly, advocate. Advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves. We ask people wherever we go to talk to your government officials, talk to your MPs. Let them know that this is an important thing for you as Christians, for you as Canadians to support, that we want their support as well. Because we are one of the well-off countries. So we need your assistance to help the MPs understand that it's important so they continue to recognize this as something that needs to be done. And you can do that. There's a letter writing tool on our website at foodgrainsbank.ca that allows you to very easily type in your postal code. There's a letter there that's pre-written. Most of it you can add in your own comments, and I encourage you to take a look at that on our website and help send that off to the MPs. Next slide. So I want to thank you for your time. I hope that I've imparted a little bit about the work of Canadian Foodgrains Bank and given you something to think about. It's a great organization, and I don't say that because I work for them. I say that because of my experience with them in the many, many years prior to actually working for them. They do wonderful work. I've seen it myself, and I know that they are highly respected around the world for the work that they do. So thank you for supporting the work of Foodgrains Bank. And I say that also on behalf of the many people that I met when we were in Malawi and when we were in India. Because we would ask them, what is one of the things that we can tell the people back in Canada? What is something that's important for you to have them hear from you? And they would invariably say thank you, because they are so grateful, and they don't take it for granted that the help is there. They are just very grateful for the help that they are getting. So I say, on behalf of them, thank you very much.
Before you go, I'd like to say thank you for bringing your message of challenge and of hope to us today. And there is a check in there for the Canadian Foodgrains Bank for $150, and I hope that others will be matching it.
Again, I thank you very much for that, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and I will be around for a while afterwards if anybody has any questions. So thank you very much.
Our next hymn is from Voices United, number 399, For the Crowd of Thousands.